And now, the First Alert Storm Team, live from the 13 Now digital desk. This is Tropic Topics, sponsored by Peden Heating and Air Conditioning and Mariana Toyota.
Hello, everyone. I'm Chief Meteorologist Ross Whitley, and we are starting out talking about Ian. Actually, that's all we're going to be talking about here. I'm going to try to make this as quick as possible. I like to start off every time with that we are talking about the panhandle forecasting here. If you're watching from some other area, certainly you continue to watch this. I'm going to talk about track and impacts across the rest of the areas as well, even including down to the peninsula. But specifically, I'm talking about the panhandle here. I don't have time, mainly because I've got shows this afternoon that I got to get ready for. Don't have time to talk about specific forecastings for locations. So as I'm talking about the panhandle, I'm talking about Bristol, I'm talking about Blountstown, I'm talking about Holmes County, I'm talking about Jackson County. So I will get as specific as I possibly can. But if you have any other questions or concerns, things that I'm not answering in the video already, you can put those in those comment sections. I've got all of the pages on Facebook up. So I've got myself, I've got the WMVB page. I also have Kristen and Grace's page as well. So you can ask a question in any of those comment section as well. And I will try to get to those questions as soon as possible. But we're going to start out with analysis here and talk about Ian. Ian, you can see pretty clearly right there in the middle of the screen. It is now a Category 1 hurricane. It is pretty rapidly intensifying at this point. We did get a little lucky today as far as intensification goes because you can tell that there is dry air here, and that dry air has kind of entrained itself into the system in the mid-levels just a touch, and that certainly helped out as we went through this morning. It got into the eye wall and kept it from rapidly intensifying through the morning and mid-afternoon hours. But it seems to have corrected that and is now well on its way. And I do expect that it will continue to intensify as we go through the rest of this evening into the overnight hours, where it will then pass through Cuba. And that is where we're going to start, because Cuba is important as far as forecast details down the road. If we get something more like this, not that far, I did not mean to do that far. A little pen got to me there. If we get something like this and it's that far off to the east, then we're probably bringing South Florida back into the picture here for a harder turn. If it is way west off to the west of the western tip of Cuba, then we are talking about the western solutions verifying. Today we've seen more of a north-northwest movement instead of a northwest movement or west-northwest, which was kind of predicted by the models. So today has been more in line with being collected by that trough and making that harder turn, which is part of the reason why I think the hurricane models are starting to come to consensus here with that sharper east turn, is because we're getting more of that north motion than a northwest motion with the overall storm, which certainly means that the high pressure ridge here that was being forecasted is not nearly as amplified, so we're not getting as much of a easterly push by that ridge. Instead, since it's coming in weaker, or is at least delivering as a weaker high, it is allowing the storm to go more off to the north, which is more in line with the overall ridge here, which is kind of oriented in that direction. So that would pull the storm more off to the north, and that screen is super messy now, so now you can't see anything going on. But what's going on is that we have the low here. That's the trough that is starting to dig in. We have continental dry air diving in to the south and east, and we now have the cold front basically approaching our area here in the panhandle. And this is a relatively occluded low pressure system. So this is a pretty deep trough overall, and a pretty strong one for September anyways. That is large in part due thanks to Fiona. So remember Fiona last week coming up here and going like that. That actually really buckled the jet stream and allowed for this trough to dig in so deep. So that's part of the reason why the modeling has been so hard, just because sampling this trough has been difficult, mainly because it's not a typical setup, at least for this time of year. The other thing here is there's a lot of marginal cases. That's a big issue as well. The marginality to it, meaning that it could be picked up by the trough, and maybe just a wobble to the west will allow it to miss the trough. That seems like a less likely solution, as today the things have basically trended the same as they did yesterday, if not slightly off to the east. And the 18Z hurricane models, which I'm going to get to, all came in with a much better consensus and a harder turn to the east, which is certainly a realistic possibility. So we're going to get into that. So think about that in the panhandle. Any turn to the east is good news for us in the panhandle, because that means less and less impacts. Right now, as forecasted, even where the cone is further off to the west than where I think is going to be in tonight's update or the 5 o'clock update, is that we're not going to see much. Right now, we're not expecting a whole lot across our area. It's still going to be breezy, and I'll talk about why we're going to still see breezy conditions both Thursday and Friday. And by breezy, I mean 15 to maybe 30 mile per hour winds, and gusts could be as high as 40 across much of the area. So, if you got loose stuff outside, you're hanging stuff for, I don't know, Halloween already, if you're that much of a Halloween enthusiast, I would certainly think about, securing those items, just because we are going to have some really breezy conditions if you haven't done so already. But for now, Franklin and Gulf County, really Franklin County, appears to have the biggest potential threat to see any kind of significant impacts from this. And even then, we're probably talking about tropical storm type of conditions across Franklin County, and then that would include into Wakulla County as well as Jefferson and Leon counties. So they could potentially see tropical storm type of conditions. And the extent to the rain to the west is really going to depend on track, because it's going to have such a tight gradient on the western side, meaning that we may be talking about a few miles between heavy rainfall and no rain whatsoever. I think we see at least some shower activity extending across much of the panhandle, but we could be, quite frankly, with the current track, it could be that we don't see a single drop of rain in Bay County, and it might rain fairly heavily in Franklin County and possibly Liberty County, and then maybe even in Jackson County. But Bay and Washington and Holmes don't see any rain at all. So any shift to the east certainly means that more of our area is dry and has less potential impacts. Any shifts to the west in the official forecast track will certainly bring in more impacts to our area. Again, as currently forecasted, we would have minor impacts across our area, which would be, breezy conditions and some showery conditions, with the biggest impacts coming into Franklin County. Now, obviously, that can still change. We got a long way to go here, but it has been a positive trend over the last 2 days, at least for Bay County. Now, for other areas, it has been the complete opposite. Say for Tampa, it has been much worse of a scenario going forward, and we're going to get to that as we go through the rest of this. So going on forward here, let's talk about the official cone and where the forecast is. And I also want to point out an interesting tidbit here. This is kind of a nerd thing more or less than anything. This has a very trichoidal motion, meaning that it wobbles a lot. It's basically doing circles with its path instead of going in one consistent direction. We've seen that a good bit today, and we've seen that really in the track. You can kind of see this S-ing back and forth here on the track, and that is that motion. And I think that that's going to continue until we really get this to organize and get into a major hurricane, which I'd still expect that to happen. So as we do go forward, I'm going to put the track into motion so that you can see it. I do still expect that through the rest of tonight into tomorrow, with the exception of when it crosses over Cuba, where there will be probably a slight weakening period, we're still going to see this get up to major hurricane status, possibly as high as a Category 4, maybe even a mid-level Category 4. So I could see anything between 140 and 150 miles per hour, which is on the higher end of a Category 4 being a realistic probability. The good news, at least for our area, is that once it gets to Wednesday, so sometime during the day on Wednesday, so about that latitude, even if you go further across, that's when dry air is really going to be driving in. That's also when wind shear is really going to be picking up. So as we get to Wednesday, through the day on Wednesday, we're going to start to see dry air entrained in the system, and we're going to start to see a decoupling of the lower level and the upper level. What that means is that they go in two different directions. And storms, as we've mentioned before, especially tropical systems want to be vertically stacked. They don't want to be tilted. So as we get a decoupling, we get a tilt. So what that means is that the lower level core is not in line with the upper level core. And so as that heat flux exchange is happening, it's not happening efficiently. So you get a weakening. And then you put dry air into that's subsistence. That means that you start to dissipate some of that moisture in that heat flux. You get a cooling effect with subsistence. So you get more decoupling. So it's kind of a runaway feedback loop, if you will, as we get shear and dry air in. So once that starts happening, it'll happen pretty frequently. Unfortunately, with this track, it is possible that if we get a harder turn to the right, we still have a major hurricane that is happening because it just hasn't had enough time to decouple and shear and dry air to really work against it. So if a harder turn to the right, think Wilma, think Charlie, where we had those harder turns to the right, that's the possibility where you still have a major hurricane making impacts basically from Tampa down through here. So even though you're not in the cone here in Fort Myers, really going up toward Cape Coral, you're kind of right on the edge. I would still really be paying attention to the forecast tracks as we go through the next 12 and 24 hours. And I would certainly be getting prepared. A, you're definitely going to have storm surge in those areas. B, it's quite possible that this ends up as a further to the south track of Tampa than on the northern side of Tampa. Now, model consensus is basically exactly where the cone is. And National Hurricane Center always goes with model consensus. That means that it is the middle, the average of all of the models, because that is the best forecast. It is using the most potential input and the highest probability. That's going to continue to be the best forecast. It's what I always try to convey when we're talking about just even the simple things, is that, a highest probability of something, that's my job. My job is to tell you what the highest probability of something happening. It's not to tell you exactly what's going to happen, because no person on the planet knows exactly what's going to happen, especially when you're talking about massive variables like tropical systems. So what we're supposed to communicate is what is most likely to happen. Obviously, outliers can happen. And in the case of this system, an outlier being a harder turn to the right would be bad, would be not so great. So we certainly don't want that. Now, obviously, anything to the south of Tampa would be great news for Tampa, because the wind would be out of the north, and that would be pulling the water out of the base instead of pushing the water into the base. But that is not currently the solution. And a very ironic twist, the GFS and the Euro have kind of flipped on where they are saying the solutions to this system is going to go. But you can see a very, very tight consensus at this point in time. This is the highest amount of consistency we have seen out of the models, which I always speak to when we're talking about these models. You want to look at grouping. You don't want to be looking at the outliers or individual lines, because none of the models are good, but they can be useful. And when you use all of them together, the usefulness of the models certainly help. So when they're all seeing the same thing, that's a higher confidence that we are getting closer and closer to the correct forecast. So right now, the National Hurricane Center has basically this track going in. Model consensus is right here now. So I'm willing to bet that they kind of split the middle between that, and they'll shift it a little further off to the south and east as we get into the next update that will be coming out at 4 o'clock. So when we get to that next update, I'm willing to bet we see another slight shift off to the east. But that doesn't mean that the Panhandle is completely out of the woods here. And that's because as this system does slow down and decouple, even though the core may continue to do this, the upper level might decide to kind of track off that way, because that's where the upper level influence is going to go. So it's still possible that we see some decent impacts, especially to Franklin County, possibly Liberty County as well, as that decoupling happens and we get that. Now, thankfully, we are on the good side of the system. We're on the west side, which means that convective activity, meaning thunderstorms, is not very likely. I would say that the threat of tornadoes at this point, being on the western side, is about zero. It would have to shift way off to the west for us to be in that severe threat. Where this is a concern to me, as far as what's probably not being communicated, is that since we are going to have that dry air entrainment, Dry air is actually one of the ingredients that you need in severe thunderstorms to produce tornadoes. And those bands, when they have dry air to take advantage of, they can really spin up some supercell structures. So really through South Florida, even extending out into the Keys and going even into eastern Florida, we're probably talking about a pretty decent tornado threat as this does continue to move off in that direction, because we are going to have that curvature banding coming through here, going all the way up the peninsula. So if you are anywhere in the peninsula, you are probably going to have at some point in time, as this does work up the western coast, you're probably going to have a tornado threat at some point in time as that does work up the coast. So you certainly want to be paying attention to your local forecast impacts and looking at your local meteorologist. That means your local National Weather Service as well as your local television crews, because they're the ones that are going to be able to communicate the threats to your local area much better than I can, because my area is the Panhandle. So if you're watching from outside of the Panhandle, I don't know your area as well as I know the Panhandle. So I'm going to give a forecast for the Panhandle, not those specific areas, but certainly concerned that we do get that harder turn and we get a longer fetch of wind going into Tampa Bay. It's certainly probably the highest potential impact out of this system is a long duration south or west southwest wind into Tampa Bay that would push a very high amount of water into what is a relatively shallow bay, which would mean you would have a lot of water rise through Tampa Bay. So I think last I heard they had a mandatory evacuation in Zone A there, and I'm not sure about the other evacuations in that area. So if you are watching from Tampa, please, please, please check with your local emergency managers, find out what zone you are in, what flood zone you are in. They are corresponding A, B, and C, and find out what zone you're in, find out if you are under an evacuation. And if you are under a mandatory evacuation, that is a mandatory evacuation. That means leave. That does not mean you can stay. That means you need to leave. And in fact, it also means that if you do stay and you get in trouble and you need someone to come rescue you, no one's coming. So that's what they're saying when they say mandatory evacuation. They're telling you, we will not come save you if you decide to stay. So if you are under that mandatory evacuation, please leave. The highest amount of fatalities that happen during tropical systems happen because of storm surge. Because people think, I can wait till the storm hits, and then if it gets bad, I'll leave. Well, storm surge comes in extremely fast. And I mean extremely fast. A matter of minutes can be feet of water. So you can go from having basically no storm surge to 10 minutes having 3 feet of storm surge sitting on your property. And you're not going anywhere in a vehicle in 3 feet of storm surge. Your vehicle will float at about 14 inches of water, depending on how heavy your vehicle is, at about a foot. Your vehicle will float, meaning that you're not going anywhere. So at 2 feet, 3 feet, your vehicle is no longer even touching the ground. So at that point in time, you're not going anywhere. So you're stuck. So that's why they're saying, please leave. That's why they're telling you it's a mandatory evacuation, because they're not going to come get you. And you're not going to have the time to just say, well, I'll just wait until it gets bad. You might not have an escape route. You know, your escape routes might all get flooded out, which is why you're probably in flood zone A, because you don't have an escape route. So think about that as you do get those evacuation orders as we go through the coming days. And looking at the timeline here, that's what this is corresponding with. Had a lot of confusion when I posted this map on social media about the extent, because I had the red going all the way over here, and people were like, oh, it's going to hit Mobile. That's not what this is. What we're saying here is a timeline of as the storm is passing by. So I'm not saying that the areas in red are going to be impacted or the areas in green are going to be impacted or purple or blue. What I'm saying is this is the timeline that the colors correspond with timing. So on Tuesday, the storm will be off to the west of the Keys. On Wednesday, the storm will be off to the west of Cape Coral. On Thursday, the storm will be either approaching, moving into, or working just slightly off to the west of Tampa. On Thursday night going into Friday, it'll be up near the Horseshoe area, going into maybe like Stenshahatchee and that location, Cedar Key. And in fact, I think that is pretty close to where they have the landfall at the current moment, but I do believe that is going to shift to the east. So that would be Thursday night. And then going Thursday night into Friday, guess what? That's when it's passing through the Panhandle. By the time we get to Saturday morning, the storm will be all the way up into Georgia. So thankfully, unfortunately, the storm slows down through here. And thankfully, the storm speeds up through here. So once we do get this on land and it starts to really decouple and fall apart, this is going to be moving out of the area pretty quickly. There's still a flood threat potential for portions of Georgia, South Carolina, and the Carolinas. That's more as this becomes post-tropical and starts to pick up the Atlantic moisture and shove that in that direction, more so than it has to do with the center of the storm. So basically, in those areas, you would want to look for the eastern side of the low because that's where the heavy rain is going to be, as well as the northern aspect of the low. So it would be eastern and northern aspect of the low would be where we would see flooding issues. So potentially, you could see flooding issues probably maybe as far west like that. But again, any eastern shift would take that further away. And I'm not seeing this being a major flooding event as it does move inland. More so, we're going to see more rain through the peninsula than we are probably anywhere else. So that's where we are on that. That's where we are on timeline. So here we go. As we go forward, we're going to zoom in here so you can see a couple more of the areas. And you can see that the track is well off to the east at this point in time of the Panhandle, meaning that at this point, maybe only Franklin County is seeing any kind of issues. So I did update the Ready, Set, Go map as well. I think this is a very useful map. But it also, doesn't correspond with everything. So what I'm highlighting here is that coastal areas all the way down the peninsula are going to see a storm surge and flooding threat because of repeat banding that will be moving into the area, as well as a tornado threat going through that. So that's why I'm saying that's that go zone. So if you feel like that you're in a good spot and you're not under a mandatory evacuation and you feel comfortable staying, so be it. But my suggestion is always going to be whatever your comfortability level is to think about that clearly and think about what you're willing to put up with, especially if you do lose power for 3, 4, 5 days, or in the event of something catastrophic, a week, maybe 2 weeks. Do you have the supplies for that? Are you willing to not be able to use a toilet consistently for 2 weeks without power? Are you willing to go without a hot meal for a week without power? Are you willing to go without a shower for a week? Are you willing to do all of those things? Because those are realistic possibilities as that storm does move either into the peninsula or up the peninsula, is that you are cut off from power for potentially up to a week, maybe longer. In the event that we have a harder turn and a major hurricane come in, we'd have bigger wind issues, which would lead to more power outages. And certainly we're going to have the flooding issue if it does make that turn into Tampa Bay like the new hurricane models are suggesting. So going through the scenario here just to show you how this plays out. Also want to highlight just how sharp the western edge is here with dry air and shear getting into it. So there's going to be a very, very sharp gradient in the Panhandle between rain and no rain. And I mean that seriously because we are going to have a lot of dry air coming into this storm. So you'll see the western edge, basically a very sharp line on the western edge as this does continue to move inland. And then kind of fading off to the north and east, that is that decoupling. So as it fades off to the north and east, you get that decoupling and you see that. But basically, what I'm highlighting here is potential heavy rainfall, and you're getting ready to see exactly what that means as far as rainfall totals go and what that would mean for our area if it did follow this exact path. Now, obviously, any shift to the west brings higher impacts into the Panhandle, but you can see exactly where the heavy rain is likely going to fall and where the heavy rain is not going to fall. So the potential here is that Franklin County, you may actually be on the deciding line here. In fact, including most of our area may, outside of Alligator Point, might not see that much in the way of substantial rainfall. So in the yellow areas, we're talking about 1 to 4 inches of rain. And the purple areas, we're talking about 5+ inches of rain. In the white areas, that is 7+ inches of rain. So you can see that exactly where the storm goes really does matter. And over in the green areas, that is less than an inch. So you're talking about approximately 1 inch of rain in the green areas. So that would mean in the current solution, if that verified, Bay County sees some light showers. And that's about it, including going up into Holmes County, through Calhoun down into Gulf as well. So in this scenario, if this verifies or it goes further off to the east, we see some light showers and some breezy conditions. And I still think we are going to see breezy conditions because as we do get that decoupling and the upper level core, you can tell exactly where the upper level core goes and where the lower level core goes, which is why I do think you're seeing the split in the models. So as we do get that motion where lower level versus upper level goes, you are still going to have wind that is going to be around the pressure gradient of that low pressure system, which will be transferring from the lower level here to the upper level. And so what that means for us is a fairly breezy conditions out of the north and northwest. It also means that basically through here, we're pushing water offshore. Same thing even in Franklin County, you're going to be pushing water offshore. I do expect we're going to see some big waves, but it's probably going to be like primo surf conditions because we're going to have that wind stacking those waves up, nice clean breaks. So for surfers, I'm willing to bet that you're going to see a good amount of surfers in the area Thursday and Friday as those waves do roll in and that north wind stacks it up and you get a nice long period between breaks. I'm expecting that that's what you're going to see. But for you non-surfers out there, Thursday, Friday, possibly even Saturday as we go forward, probably a no-go into the Gulf of Mexico. I know the big waves, they look like fun. They're not fun. It will increase our rip current threat. It will increase our erosion threat, and it's likely going to be double red flag days. So please, if we have double red flags flying across the area, don't get into the Gulf. I mean, you know, especially if you see somebody who is here vacationing from one of these areas that is evacuated, they shouldn't be getting into the Gulf either. It would be a really sad story to have somebody go from Tampa, where they evacuated, and then come over here and hang out for a couple of days, get into the Gulf, and then not go home. That would not be good. So we don't want that either. So even though the weather may end up being nicer for us, if we do get this east shift, or we stay off to the east as is forecasted right now, we don't want anyone getting into the Gulf of Mexico and then not being able to go home. So double red flags are flying. That means stay out of the water. It means the water is closed to all swimmers and all pedestrians. Do not get in. There is a surfer exception for surfboards, but even then, you might want to think about it. Unless you're an experienced surfer with the bigger waves, you might want to think about it. So yeah, that's where we are. I'll get off of that and we'll move on because I do have other things that I have to take care of. So this is the potential wind speed. So you'll see the broadening out here as we do go forward. You'll see that really, really tight, and then all of a sudden you're going to start to see it really broaden out. So see it broaden out, and you saw briefly there where we did see a brighter area basically in here. That would be, 20, 30, maybe gust up to 40. So that's kind of what I'm thinking at the moment. I'm thinking that through our area, we're probably going to see about 15 to 30 mile per hour winds with gusts maybe up to 45 across our area. So that would be in here. That's where I think we're going to see that. Once you get closer to that core, obviously the wind speeds go up. So that means Franklin County through the Bend, down into even the western side of that, you're probably talking about tropical storm force. So that means that we could see possibly sustained 40 to 45, maybe gust up to 50. So that's going to be right along the coast through the Bend. And then obviously the worst of this is going to be through here, depending on where we get that shift or not further off to the east. Now, obviously, if you're in this area, if we do get that hard turn like that, that clearly means that you're seeing less impacts as far as wind goes, and even severe threat. So a harder turn for you certainly is good news. While it might be bad news for others, it's certainly good news for the Bend through the Nature Coast if we do get that harder turn, because that would be more or less wind across that area. So going forward, as we do continue on here, we're going to continue to see the potential impacts shifted further and further off to the east, just depending on how the system inevitably does evolve. So moving on to the following slide here, just to get through it. This is the tropical storm force wind probabilities at this moment in time. And you'll notice that it is the northern side, the right at center and off to the east where we do have those highest probabilities. So That means at this point in time, Cape Coral, guess what? You have about a 96% chance of seeing tropical storm force winds. And at this point in time, Tampa has a 93% chance of seeing tropical storm force winds. And at the current moment, we have less than a 40% chance of even tropical storm force winds in Franklin County. So we're talking about 20% or less in Bay County. Again, still talking about breezy conditions across our area. Don't want to discount that at all, but definitely better than saying that we've got other issues that we'd be dealing with as we do go forward. So going on in. You sure we're up? Yeah. Okay. Again, sorry, just double checking here. I do want to get to those questions, so just want to wrap things up as fast as I can. So this is storm surge potential, and obviously this has shifted way off to the east from where I had it yesterday, and we're talking about less of a chance of seeing much in the way of water rise, with exception to Franklin County. So with that north wind, we're probably not going to see much, maybe a foot, maybe 2 feet at most across the area, probably less than that. We were going to get some water rise. It's just not going to be that impactful. The biggest issue is probably going to be waves and then beach erosion as that does happen. So double red flag conditions, rip current conditions, those issues as this storm does pass off to our east with that wind. So that is it. We're going to wrap it up right there. And we're going to get to questions now because of the interruption. I do apologize. You probably got all of your questions taken away. So I'm going to give you a minute here to go through it and think about anything that I did not answer. And again, try to stay away from the potential, asking me about specific locations. I'm not going to sit here and forecast for specific locations. I just don't have the time to do it. And if you missed anything in the overall forecast, make sure you go back and watch it. I probably answered a lot of the questions that you want to ask. So make sure you do go back and watch the video as well. If you don't have the 13 Now app, go ahead and download that. If you don't have the Storm Track 13 app, go ahead and download that. Those are great ways to get information pushed to you in the event that we do have this shift more off to the west, and is a good information as well as notifications just to have on the Storm Track 13 app for everyday weather, because that is our forecast. So unlike other apps out there, Weather Underground, AccuWeather, Weather Channel, whatever you have on your phone, they're all using guidance, which means they're using probably the GFS, and that means that your app changes 4 times dailies. Ours changes twice because ours is our morning forecast that we input when Kristen comes in, and then the evening forecast when I come in that I'd put in. So you get our specific forecast as opposed to model guidance. There is a little bit of a blend because obviously we can't put in every location, but overall it is our forecast and our input. So go ahead and have that. Plus, you can follow the spaghetti models that we showed earlier. You can see how those track. The hurricane cone is going to be on there as well. All of those things can be turned on the radar level. So you can track all of that. You can get lightning updates, you get lightning notification, you get severe weather alerts, all things that are great to have. So I think I have wasted enough time here that you have been able to ask your questions. So we're going to jump right into those questions. First question, what are the chances it turns more west when it gets into the Gulf? There's still that possibility. The models have kind of dwindled on that possibility, but there is still the possibility that we do see something where this is further off to the west. And I'm going to go back to this graphic so that you can see it and show you that. So there we go. So the purple shaded area here is the range of possibilities that are still showing up on the total ensembles. So not just the hurricane models, that's all I have on here, but I'm talking about all ensembles from Euro GFS, UK Met, and the Canadian. This is where it has narrowed down the possible range of solutions for the storm to go. So again, with that said, the nice thing about what has happened with the trend here is that because we are going to see that dry air and shear come in about the time that the storm reaches that area, the majority of the storm is then going to become asymmetric, which means from the center off to the east. So even if we do see a shift further off to the west, and in my opinion, and really most of the model's opinion here now, is that Franklin County is about as far west as it's going to go. So that still means that we're on, for most of the panhandle here, we're on the good side of the system. Now, obviously, if it did go that far west, we'd be talking about a flood potential. We'd be talking about even wind potential. The worst possible solution for us at this point is about a Category 1 hurricane. So that's about as strong as the system could be coming into our area if that were to happen. But that is certainly an outlier at this point. So if we did get this kind of situation where it came up here, kind of slowed down and paused, and then made a turn like that, which is what some of the models have tried to indicate as a possibility. If we do have that actually happen, the strongest this will be at that point in time would be a Category 1 hurricane. Obviously, significant impacts. It would definitely be more of a direct impact than what is forecasted at the moment, and we would see the potential for flash flooding and flooding issues. We still wouldn't have much of a tornado threat because the tornado threat would be over here, away from the center and in that bands. So we still wouldn't have that severe potential, but we would have stronger winds, possibly, high-end tropical storm force winds across a good portion of the area, and definitely would see higher rainfall totals. Would probably be in the 4 to 5, maybe 6 or 7 inch range if that were to happen. But that would be a pretty significant shift at this point, especially with the hurricane models showing a pretty decent consensus at this point over here. So I kind of doubt that we'll see that. More or less, the west solutions that make sense is that you get something that comes in here kind of slowly works, decouples and fades, and you get the upper level to do something like that. And in that case, we're really not changing the forecast a whole lot, because even though we would see more rain across the area, probably 1 to 3 inches, we're not talking about a substantial change to the overall forecast, because it would be a fairly weak system and we'd still be on the good side of the storm. So good question there. Let's go off to the next one. What you got? We got another one. What is the storm app called? Okay, it is the Storm Track 13 app. If you go to the Apple Store or Google Play Store, the graphic it shows is going to say Storm Tracker 13 app, and that's because our lovely creative services individual who made the design for that put Storm Tracker 13 app, even though the app is called Storm Track without the ER on it, Storm Track 13 app. But that in the bottom left corner right there, that's what the logo is going to say, Storm Tracker, not Storm Track. So yeah, there is that. Let's see here. Ross, why is it moving so slowly? How can it move faster? Please make it disappear while you're at it. I have no ability to make the storm disappear. The storms move because they're being propelled or they're being pulled. Storms are not alive. Part of the reason why I have a pet peeve of not calling a storm a her or he, even though the names are gender specific, because storms are not living people. So they're not alive. They don't make decisions. They get propelled or pushed or stalled because the steering currents disappear. The only constant force in a tropical system is Coriolis. That's it. That's the only constant force, and that pulls things poleward, which is why you always see systems go north, because you have a constant Coriolis force. That's because the Earth is spinning. If that force disappeared, we got bigger issues than a tropical system. We're gonna have a whole lot of big issues if the Earth stops to spin. That's what Coriolis force is. So that's what happens. So it is moving actually pretty quickly at this point. It's moving off to the north-northwest at 13 miles per hour on the last update. So that is definitely a relatively quick movement. It should slow in this area. That's because the trough comes in. And as the trough comes in, you get the wind shear, and then you got a ridge that's actually working against that forward movement. So that northerly movement is going to be pressed against because you have the front and you have the ridge that is coming in. So that's going to slow down the storm because right now what it's being propelled by is a high off to the east. So that's what's pulling it or pushing it off to the north, and then eventually off to the north and east. You get the shear and then you get the ridge. So you can see that the directions kind of cancel each other out, which is why we've had all the crazy solutions and had such a hard time being able to say specifically where this goes, because there's not a strong steering current here. It's a lot of marginal cases, which means there's a lot of variables could steer the storm in basically any direction, just assuming that, say, this force is stronger or this force is stronger or this force is stronger. So that's the reason why we've seen such wacky solutions. So good question there. Gloria, I'm only going to say this because you were a big fan, and I'm not specifically forecasting for any location. When I'm talking about our area, I'm talking about all of our area. And I get specific saying that Franklin County will likely see the worst impacts, but all of our area is probably going to see minor impacts based off of what we have now. So any specific location from Panama City up to Paxton to Holmes County through Graceville into Mariana and Bluntstown and Bristol and all the other locations in between, probably going to see very similar conditions, which is breezy conditions Thursday and Friday, winds 15, maybe as high as 30 miles per hour. Showery activity is certainly possible as well from Thursday evening, Thursday night, and then going through Friday midday. And the highest gust potential at this point in time is probably about 40, 45 miles per hour. So that is the forecast for our area, exception being Franklin County, where it's going to be closer to the center and right on the coast, say St. George Island, Dog Island. You're likely going to see the bigger impacts, A, because you got bigger waves to deal with, and B, because there's less friction because you got the water, you got the Appalachian Bay there, so you're going to see the stronger wind gusts. I wouldn't be shocked by 50, 55 mile per hour winds in that area. So there you go. What else? We got another question?
No, most of these are just all location specific. I would just maybe let people know that it's just out in the net that we weren't live for.
Okay. Yeah, so if you're just now catching it, make sure that you go back and watch the other video. We had a little power disruption, so we lost connection to the internet very briefly, which is why we got kicked off. I do apologize for that, but if you're just now joining us, make sure that you do go and watch the other video. And again, these videos were specific to the Panhandle. While I did mention a lot of potential impacts across the peninsula, if you are watching from another location, say Tampa or Clearwater or down to Cape Coral, Sarasota, Fort Myers, if you're in those areas, make sure you're checking in with your local forecasters. They're going to give you a much more specific detail about potential impacts in those areas and what you need to know. And no matter where you are, you should know who your emergency managers are and where the emergency managers' offices are and where to get information. So if you don't already know, Google that right now. Google emergency managers and your county. So whatever county you're living in, Google that and find that out so that you can find the emergency managers pages. Not only are you going to find useful information on what you should have in your hurricane kits and what you should be doing to prepare, you're also going to find information on evacuations, things like that. And as far as school closures go, I don't really foresee a reason to close any schools at this point in time outside of maybe Franklin County as this storm comes in potentially on Friday or Thursday, probably Friday. Thursday, it's going to be more of a Thursday afternoon and a Thursday night type of thing for us. So I really don't see any reason to do that outside of Franklin County at this point in time. But certainly if we do get shifts further off to the west, that's a possibility. But I don't make those decisions. That comes from your school superintendents. So they're the ones that will make that decisions. They're the ones that will communicate that. So stop asking me if school's going to close because I have no influence over whether or not school's going to close or not. So all I'm giving is a forecast. That's it. So there you go. What else? Do we have any other questions? I think I've answered all of it.
No other questions? I just mentioned when we'll be live next.
Okay, yeah. So the next update will come out in 9 minutes from the National Hurricane Center. That's when we'll get the next cone. And I am expecting that they're going to shift it again to the east because of the model consensus being further off to the south and east. They may not move it much, but I do bet that they will shift it to the east. And I will do another update. When is my next update, Spencer? 7? Is that what it is? 7, yes. Okay, so I will post my forecast from the newscast, and I will do a tropical update, not a video, but I'm going to have my forecast up there, as well as I will post some graphics from the show and update that page. So you can go to mypanhandle.com to find those updates as well. There will be also a new update at 10 tonight after I get done with the evening show. So you can find updates there at 7 and 10. Those are going to be the next immediate updates. You can also, if you're not already, follow me on social media. It's at Whitley Weather. And I'm also on Instagram at Whitley Weather WX. So I'm Whitley Weather. I know. Whitley Weather was already taken on Instagram somehow. But yeah, so it's Whitley Weather WX on Instagram. But the other ones, Facebook and Twitter, it's at Whitley Weather. So you can follow me there. I post a ton of information on that, basically echoing the same thing that I just went through on all of this. And if anything changes, I'm obviously going to post there. I'm going to post to the website. You're also going to see it at 5, 6, and 10 on News 13. So make sure you're tuning into that as well. There will be new information, again, coming out in now 7 minutes. So that will be in the 5 o'clock newscast. There will be new information at 10. So that will be in the 10 o'clock newscast. So make sure you are watching those as well, because that's just when the model updates happen. So that's going to do it. Kristen will be back tomorrow morning, and I will probably be back here at the same time tomorrow to do another discussion, and hopefully we are talking the same kind of thing, minimal impacts across our area. That would be great, or it would be even better if I just said, hey, now we're expecting no impacts across our area. That's not really a reality, because at the bare minimum, we're talking about waves and breezy conditions. So we are going to see some impact. It's not going to just go away, but we could be down to very, very low impact at that point in time. So stay tuned. And obviously, forecast shifts, changes frequently in the tropics. We get frequent changes to this. And just because this is model consensus doesn't mean that one of those outlier solutions don't happen. So I'm willing to bet that if we're going to see a shift in the model consensus, it'll happen probably late tonight, tomorrow morning, after it crosses over Cuba, because that'll be the models all of a sudden going, oh, it's going to miss the trough. That will be when we'll see a shift. If we don't have a shift by tomorrow afternoon, we're not getting a shift. That'll be it. It'll be locked in. It's already pretty close, I would say, to a fairly high consistence on what the models are showing. I mean, you can see how close the Euro and GFS are now, and you see that they are all in the grouping with the hurricane models. So they're all basically saying the same thing at this point in time. So that's pretty high confidence. But again, I would say the biggest issue would be center relocation when it crosses Cuba. Unlikely, because it's a relatively strong storm now, or a much further west track as we go throughout the day today into tonight. That's where we could see that shift off to the west. But again, that seems unlikely, because the storm has actually been on the east side of guidance all day today. So I don't see that western side solution verifying, but certainly we will keep you apprised of any changes, and make sure you're checking the forecast frequently. That's going to do it. I'll see you at 5.
Thank you for watching Tropic Topics, sponsored by Peden Heating and Air Conditioning and Marietta Toyota. Be sure to download the StormTrack 13 app today to stay up to date with all of the latest weather information. For more local news, weather, sports, and more, visit mypanhandle.com.